Hello, and I am back with another update on my research projects. So, in the last video, we left off after talking about andragogy, and I had actually spoken with a friend of mine who is a professional facilitator, and he had done a quick Google after we were just kind of talking about, the way people learn, and especially like the way adult learners learn versus the way children learn, etc. And I was like, I wonder if there's like a blend. And he had done a quick Google search or a quick web search and found out that yes, there is a blend and it's called Metagogy. So I wanted to do a little bit of digging into the concept of Metagogy and see what it was all about. And so let's dive into Metagogy. So I found this really great abstract from the Journal of Adult Education, volume 42, number 2, and it was published in 2013. The title of it is Andragogy and Metagogy, The Evolution of Neologisms. And it was authored by Claudette M. Peterson and Chris M. Ray. And so this was a very interesting because it really is talking about neologisms, which are just a new word or term that kind of become mainstream. So it's words that become, people might use them in a very niche way, but then all of a sudden everyone uses them and now it's considered a neologism. And actually, andragogy was that. So pedagogy had been pretty ubiquitous as far as it was just kind of used, and it still is used as just like, here is our approach to teaching people. But for me, it didn't always ring positive because the whole idea of pedagogy is that you are teaching children. So you're essentially kind of pouring into a quote unquote empty vessel because children don't have as much experience, as much life experience as adults. And so they don't know as much. And so the idea is that what you teach them is for the most part new, or you're kind of building on something that is new, but they don't necessarily have a lot of lived experience to compare it to. Versus with adults, adults have lived experience. They've done life. They've seen things. They've done things and all that. And so you needed another way in order to talk about teaching with them. So when I learned about andragogy, I was like, this is interesting. This makes sense. But then I started to think about like the demographic that I teach. Well, one of the demographics, because I also do adult learning, but I also teach college students. And while they are adults, they're definitely still very much on the cusp of coming out of, high school, and college is kind of that in between time before you truly enter into adulthood. Now, I teach at a university that has a very high commuter population, and we have a very, a lot of adult students who are what we call non-traditional students. And so while that is a percentage, and, it's probably is more common on our campus than it is at other universities where their population of students is typically leans more towards traditional students, still the majority of the students are in their teens, late teens, early 20s. That's the majority of them. And so I was wondering, they are coming from a pedagogy approach to education, and they are moving towards where their education is going to be very much about andragogy. But when you're in college, you're kind of straddling, like you're going from one to the other. And so to me, Metagogy seemed like a good solve for that. And so here is the definition that I pulled from. So I read this particular abstract and I kind of leaned on this because when I did some more researching and kind of digging in, I didn't find a bunch of stuff about Metagogy, and it'll make more sense as I kind of talk through the reading that I did. And so from the abstract, from this, the Andragogy and Metagogy, the evolution of neologisms, it states that while pedagogical and andragogical approaches are sometimes still discussed as though they are mutually exclusive, Metagogy is inclusive of an andragogical approach, but also includes conventional pedagogical approaches as they are appropriate to a task at hand, depending on the context, learner needs, or stated goal. And so this is why I like Metagogy, because it very neatly kind of expresses the idea that you may be talking to adult learners, but they may not have a lot of experience in a particular topic. And so in that, your approach should be somewhat pedagogical, but adult learners are typically in it for different purposes than children are, because once you have gone through the traditional education system and either graduated with your high school diploma and then begun working, or went through to college, graduated and then begun working, either way, you are no longer essentially legally mandated to go to school. Now, when you're in college, that's not legally mandated, but like you are at a point where education is a choice because you don't have to pursue additional education. So that may be where you might find yourself in situations where you don't know what's going on, but you still have lived experience, which will color how you approach learning. And so this is why Metagogy was so neat and tidy to me. But as I was reading this abstract, it was some very interesting information that they talked about adult education, which I had never even considered. They were pulling data, and there had been a time where when people talked about education, they talked about it as you're teaching children, because the shift or the focus was like, okay, it is time for us to teach children. And so we're changing all of our approach. We're not even thinking about the idea that adults can learn. And the conception was that once you learned everything you learned as a child, then that was all you needed to learn to live. And then you would really never learn anymore. But by about the early part of the 20th century, that opinion had shifted. And it's interesting because it shifted based on someone taking the time to consider ancient philosophers, ancient educators. And so they said, this is something that Malcolm Knowles said. Malcolm Knowles said, if you think about the earliest thinking and about the nature of learning, it was focused on adult learning. If you think about, when you talk about Confucius from ancient China, Confucius was someone who was an educator of adults, largely. Like adult people would go sit and learn and absorb the wisdom of Confucius. When you think about, folks like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, all these names that we learn about when we're in school, when you are, learning about them, they're teaching adults. They're not going to the schoolhouses and teaching the little children. They're teaching grown-ups because they're having these really complex ideas and conversations. And so they're not doing this for people who have no lived experience. And so that point of view made sense, because it's like, right, if you think about it, when ideas proliferate, when society kind of changes and grows based on experience, it's because of information that's passed from adult to adult, not from child to adult, or from child to child. And so it makes sense that adults can learn. I find it super interesting, and I'm going to make a note of this because this is an interesting tangent to go down, of just the idea that adults are unable to learn and you learn everything you learn as a child is interesting. And I'm curious what societal construct that's rooted in. So is that like something that we may discover is more a global thing, or does a specific group of people think that, and then that's just kind of the information that we receive? Because it's not lost on me that I am educated in the States, which means that my education has been crafted by a specific group of people who represent the majority I won't even say the majority, who represent the leading class of individuals who determine education. I'll say that, because that's not always the case across the board, but that is definitely the case more commonly than not. And so I'm going to look into that. I'm going to write that down as a sidebar research, but nonetheless, I found that interesting. And in another book from 1926, book called The Meaning of Adult Education by Lindemann, whose first name I cannot find at this scan. Lindemann noted something that I think is important when you're thinking about adult learners, is that adult learners attend classes voluntarily, as I just said. They appreciate the intrinsic merits of learning and learn according to their needs and problems rather than being focused on a particular subject. And he also noted that adult learners thrive with collaborative learning and that their life experience contribute to their learning. And so this is something to keep in mind, because when you're teaching adults, you have to understand that, one, they're choosing to be there, which is why teaching adults can sometimes feel like the conversation is more robust because they are there for a purpose. And so they're, going to jump in and get into the mix. Now, may not always happen, but I've definitely experienced that when I'm teaching adult learners versus when I've taught as young as 6th grade. And so it's definitely a difference. But it doesn't mean the 6th graders weren't engaged. It's just, it shows up differently. So that, I think, is an interesting thing to chew on. And so, yeah, I got a lot out of just researching Metagogy, because it really took me down a path of kind of thinking about adult learning even more inclusively. And so what did I learn from this point of research? Move myself over. So while Metagogy does effectively address the blending of pedagogy and andragogy, its use is almost not necessary, since both andragogy and pedagogy offer up different approaches that can be adjusted for the learner's level of experience and reason for being educated. So pedagogy and andragogy are not flat terms that just mean one thing. They both encompass, frameworks and approaches, and pedagogy has 4 different types, and then you have different things under each type. So both of them are kind of offer some flexibility. However, I am glad to have taken the time to read up on Metagogy, because I feel like its existence does show that it could be useful as I continue my research, because I might find that I do want to kind of consider the 2 gojis separately and figure out a way to combine them in a way that may not currently exist. And so I think it's still useful, even when, when you do research and you kind of find out, okay, that particular piece of information may not be a clear connector, but it's not useful. And so I'm definitely glad to have, learned this. And it's also just continued to expand my mind about adult learning. So what's next? So now that I've kind of done these foundational research about the roots of the different approaches to learning, from pedagogy to andragogy and of course metagogy, and I learned about a couple of other gojis as well. They're just kind of in the mix there. I want to start exploring some common frameworks for adult learning. So again, like I just said, andragogy, while that is a lot more encompassing of, adult learning, whereas pedagogy has the 4 types, there are frameworks that can be used to essentially implement andragogy. And so I want to look into them and see what they are. So what I'm going to do is just start by seeing what can I learn about some of the more common frameworks. So what those are, what they mean, how many of them are there, and then go from there. So stay tuned for the next installment of my research project, when I will be discussing common frameworks for adult learning. Thanks for watching.